Thank you everybody for coming along this morning to my talk. I know it's rough, the coffee still hasn't quite kicked in. Well, the third coffee hasn't quite kicked in yet. To start off today, I want to give a quick shout out to our sponsors. Without sponsors, conferences like DDD couldn't happen, or at least they wouldn't be as spectacular as they are today. So thanks to all of our sponsors, both local companies and interstate, for supporting this conference. Today, I want to talk to you about CSS Grid. If you haven't heard of it, is a spec that came to browsers a few years ago and has revolutionized the way we build layouts on the web. To start off today, I want to tell you a little story. In the beginning, there was darkness and emptiness. And then Tim Berners-Lee said, "Let there be internet." Now, the internet was much simpler in those times. It was just HTML content on a page, similar to how you would see in a Word document. But pretty soon, everybody got sick of looking at Times New Roman, and so Tim said, "Let the fonts and colors and sizes and positions be changeable." And then there was CSS. But before too long, this wasn't good enough either. I mean, you can't keep us developers happy. We wanted to do more. And it was great because then we discovered that you could use tables for creating layouts. You could break your page up into a grid. You could put tables inside of tables and merge cells together. We finally had better control over how our content was being laid out on the page. But before too long, we worked out, although tables inside tables is okay, tables inside tables, inside tables, inside tables, inside tables was not so much fun to work with. It started getting really complex, and it also made it more difficult when we started trying to make our websites work on different device sizes, which meant we often had to build a completely different website for mobile. So we started using floats. This was kind of good because it meant we were back to following the separation of concerns principles, which says that HTML is for our content and CSS is for how that content looks and feels. But before too long, we also found that floats weren't working too well either. You had to clear fix everything. There were a bunch more container divs to keep floating elements together or apart. When using media queries, you often had to reset things or do complex calculations, and you had to use a lot of important, which I know some of you think is the answer, and it makes front-end developers cry. So by the time we'd memorized how many % wide each column needed to be in a 6-column grid with a 1% margin, we were pretty excited to have Flexbox come along. We didn't have to do percentage math anymore. It reduced the number of media queries we needed, and we were able to easily vertically center content, which is something we hadn't been able to do since tables. We were finally starting to get the functionality that we needed out of our CSS. We no longer needed to write complicated code or work with percentages, and our code was more responsive than ever. But although Flexbox was really good for flowing content, we had limited control in the cross-axis, and having gaps between items tended to get things a little complicated. But things were looking up. We finally had a CSS technology that was built for layout, and in the distance we could see the cavalry was on its way. In 2017, CSS Grid launched in all new major browsers. This gave us everything we'd been asking for from CSS layouts. Like Flexbox, we were able to define a set of constraints and have the browser make our layout responsive. But we were also able to control that layout in 2 directions. With Grid, we were able to define areas of a layout. We were able to dictate how elements inside of a grid behaved. We could make our code more responsive and reduce the code that we were writing. But everybody asks, isn't this something we already had with tables? Isn't CSS Grid just a newer, slightly shinier version of the table layout that we've been scoffing at for years? No. CSS Grid is specifically built for web layouts, whereas tables are something that we used as a hack. It's designed for this use. We're also following the separation of concerns principles. HTML is for the content, and CSS is for how that content looks and feels on a page. Now, don't get me wrong, tables still have a place, but that would be when you'd expect to see a table, say a table of data, not for your layout. CSS Grid also helps us to write semantic and logical HTML. We're no longer required to write our HTML based on how the page design looks like. We can write our HTML based on the logical flow of the document and let CSS rearrange it visually. When this is done right, it means that our content is more accessible to anybody who's using a screen reader, reader mode, saving an article for later, or any other kind of assistive technology. Thanks to CSS Grid, it's now easier and faster to mock up or to build out the layout of an app. And to prove that, today we're going to build a note-taking app using CSS Grid. We've got a wireframe, which tells us how we want our app to look. And we've got a basic HTML structure. Now, it's also important to note that this is a semantic HTML structure. There are no container divs. There is nothing extra. This is pure semantic HTML. So we all know what happens next, right? This is when we spend hours fighting with trying to get the layout to work and we've got to completely restructure how the HTML looks. Let's see what happens. So our HTML structure loosely looks like this, except for with some beautiful backgrounds and effects so you can see the different elements in our grid. To start off, we're going to use something fairly simple. And we're going to say body display grid, which tells the browser we're using grid. Now this doesn't do too much. It looks about exactly as it did before because we haven't told it what our grid looks like yet. Next, we want to tell the browser how big our grid is. So if we have a look again at our wireframe, we're going to break our app up into 5 columns. So to define that, we use the property grid template columns. And so here I can write grid template columns, 200 pixels, 200 pixels, 200 pixels, 200 pixels, 200 pixels. Now, I said you could write less code with grid, didn't I? This seems a bit difficult. What happens if you want a 10-column grid? Something else grid gives us is the repeat function. So I can instead say repeat 5, 200 pixels. The repeat function allows us to define a number of times to repeat something and the size of the column that it's repeating. For example, 3 200 pixels would give us 200 pixels, 200 pixels, 200 pixels. Great thing about the repeat function is you can use whatever units you would like. You can use pixels, percentage, ems, rems, viewport widths, viewport heights, anything goes. You can also use it to define a pattern. For example, repeat 2, 10 pixels, 20 viewport widths would give you 10 pixels, 20 viewport widths, 10 pixels, 20 viewport widths. Try saying that 10 times quickly. So instead of writing with a fixed width, I could go repeat 5, 20%. So that way I don't have a fixed pixel size of the container. It will just take up, each column will take up 20%. But then what if I want to change the size of my grid? Say I want to have 7 columns. Then I've got to work out how wide each of those columns are. I don't want to do that math. So instead I could say repeat 5, 1FR. Now the FR unit is another new thing which comes to CSS Grid and is often used in the place of percentage widths. It's a little bit difficult to explain, so I'm going to try and explain it visually. Say for example, I have a grid where I have 100 pixels, 1FR, 50 pixels to FR. I also want to have a gap between each of those columns of 20 pixels. We're going to touch on the gap a bit more later. So what the FR unit does is it takes 100% of the element width, which in this case is 510 pixels. It then takes into account any existing content that we've set. And here we've got a 100 pixel column and a 50 pixel column, so that's 150 pixels. It then takes into account any gap that we've got. So we've got 20 pixel gap between 4 columns, which means there's a total gap of 60 pixels. It then looks at how many FRs there are. So here we've got 1 FR, 2 FR, total of 3 FR. Anybody able to do that math? In this case, 1 FR is equal to 100 pixels. So that grid would become 100 pixels, 100 pixels, 50 pixels, 200 pixels. So if I have a look at my grid again, repeat 5, 1 FR, that's saying that I want to have 5 columns, all of which should be equal width. This means that if I change the number of columns in my grid, I don't have to work out the percentage anymore. The browser's going to do it for me. So if we have a look at what that looks like in our grid, you can see our elements have now started to lay themselves out on the grid. They've taken up 4 columns out of our 5 column grid because there's only 4 elements there. Next, we're going to define the rows. So if we have a look at our wireframe again, we have 3 rows here. We've got the header, the main section, and then the footer row. So we're going to use a similar property, grid template rows, and I'm just going to define 100 pixels, 1 FR, 20 pixels. So fixed, header, and footer, and then the main content. Next, we want to start placing our elements in the grid. So to start off, we want to tell it where our header is going to sit. So we're going to define grid column start. This says where we want our header to start, which is at line 1 in the grid, so right at the very beginning. Now, CSS Grid defines numbers each of its lines, goes right from the beginning, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. But then CSS Grid also counts those backwards. So -1, -2, -3, -4, -5, -6. This is really useful because say we want our header to go all the way across the top. I could just say 1 to 6, but then if I change how many columns wide our grid is, I need to change which line it's going to. So instead, I can say 1 to -1, which is right at the end. So it doesn't matter how wide the grid is, the header is going to go from 1 all the way to -1. You can also use the shorthand, so grid column 1/-1. There's a lot of different ways that you can define the grid column as well. It really depends on the situation. So for example, you can also say grid column span 5. So I want it to span 5 columns. But today, as we said, the header should go all the way across the top. So we're going to say grid column 1/-1, which has now stretched our header all the way across the top. And you can see the rest of the elements have now been pushed down onto the second row in our grid. Starting to get somewhere. Next, we want to assign the nav. So we want the nav to take up just the first column, but the second and third row. So we're going to define grid row span 2. So we want it to span 2 rows. We don't need to define grid column because it's only going to span 1 column. So you can see our nav has now pushed down onto the bottom row as well. Next, we want to assign our main content. So that's where our main note is. And we're going to say main grid column span 4. So we want it to span 4 columns, which pushes that all the way out. And then you can see the footer has been pushed down onto the bottom row again. finally, we want our footer to take up the remainder of the grid. So we're going to say grid column span 4. And you can see the footer has now pushed all the way out to the end and filled our grid in. Now, one of the other useful things about CSS Grid is it gives us the ability to name these areas, which makes it a bit easier for when laying elements out in your grid. So once we've defined our columns and rows, we can also use grid template areas and actually assign names to them and where different areas are combining. So for example, you can see here there's one word for each column and one line for each row in our grid. So the top should be all header, the nav should be the first column of the second and third row, the note should go the rest of the way along the second row, and the footer should go the rest of the way along the bottom row. This is really good because it makes it much easier when you're rearranging a layout. You can just rearrange the grid template areas here. Once we've defined these, we then go through and assign grid areas to each of our elements in the grid. Header, grid area header, nav, grid area nav. Naming things is hard. Main is grid area note, just to be a little bit different, and footer is grid area footer. So this will look pretty much exactly like what it did before. Now this is where one of the useful tools for CSS Grid comes into play. Anybody here use Firefox as their main dev browser? If you're using CSS Grid, you need to install it and use it because they have a grid inspector tool, which is amazing, particularly when you're getting started, and then even when you use it every day, their grid inspector tool is fantastic. Firefox Grid Inspector allows you to inspect your grid and have a look at what's going on. You can overlay any named areas, you can see lines. It is a complete life changer if you're using Grid, so make sure you're using that. So, basic layout of our app, done. In 7 lines of CSS and about 10 minutes. That's pretty impressive. Anybody think that was possible before they came here today? But if we have a look at our wireframe again, what we actually wanted in the middle, so we actually wanted our note to take up most of the section, but it had a little sidebar there as well where a lot of the meta info and all of the tags are. But if you have a look, that's not really what it looks like right now. So those are still taking up the main section in the middle. We want the article to take up just the first 3 columns and the sidebar to take up the 4th column. So here we can use another property which we would apply to the main element, which is display contents. Now what display contents does is, so if we have a look at our main element here, we've got a main element, inside of that is an article and a side element, and both of those have their own content inside of it. What display contents does is it basically makes that main element disappear. And so article and aside then become children of the grid instead of the main element. So if we assign display contents to the main element, that will then make article and aside take up their own separate columns in the grid rather than taking up the full section. And we can then place them similarly to how we placed the rest of the elements. So we can rejig our template areas here. So the middle row, instead of being note, 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 it should just be note, note, side, note, 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 sidebar. So that note takes up 3 columns, the sidebar takes up the final column. We can then assign a grid area to article and aside, and that pushes the article out and keeps the sidebar in the end. So that's pretty cool. One thing that's worth noting though is, so there's a bug, and it's not meant to happen, and it's only in some browsers. But in some browsers, when you apply display contents to an element, for example, the main element, it makes the whole thing disappear, including the children. So you know how display contents is meant to do this? In these browsers, according to screen readers, it does this. So it will still appear on the page. So when you're looking at it, you may look at it and go, it's fine. The content's there, it's fine. But if you're not testing with screen readers, the screen reader doesn't know it's there. It doesn't announce it. And so anybody who's using an assistive technology won't get anything that's inside of that element. There's a bit more information about what's going on with this here in this really great article by Adrian Roselli. Don't worry about taking notes of all of these resources. They will be tweeted out hands-free as I'm going along and also on my slides at the end. The gist of this article, though, is just don't go messing with the DOM. Don't play with the DOM. Thankfully, there is a better alternative. CSS SubGrid has come to the rescue. So we want our layout to look like this. Rather than making the main element disappear, we can just align the article and aside elements as part of the main grid. Now you can define a separate grid on main and just completely do it that way, which is fine. But then if you change the size of the overall parent grid, you've got to change the size of the child grid. It gets complicated. SubGrid allows you to define it so that it aligns with the parent grid. So if we take our grid template areas back here, so where it says note, 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 all the way along, where it was looking like that, we then want to, instead of display contents, we want to say display grid. So that looks like that. That's now filling out the whole area that it's got. Now, rather than defining that this grid should be 4 columns wide and then having to redefine it when the parent grid changes, what we can instead do is say grid template columns subgrid. So we want it to take into account however many columns the main element does. If you have a look here, you can see our article and aside have now taken places as part of the parent grid, even though they're grandchildren elements. All we have to do then is assign where article and aside would sit inside of that subgrid. So article grid column span 3, and that's pushed it all the way out. So this one will work with screen readers. Now, SubGrid is still relatively new. There's lots of information about it though. The Mozilla Dev Docs are fantastic. They've got lots of information. Also, Rachel Andrew has a lot of really great blog posts and talks on it if you're looking for more information. One of the other questions that comes up with Grid is, does it replace Flexbox? If I haven't learned either of them, can I just learn Grid and not have to worry about Flexbox? Do I not use Flexbox? Do I just use Grid everywhere? Now, let me ask you a question. Batgirl's pretty awesome, right? She kicks ass. Black Canary's also pretty awesome. But do we question whether or not we only need one of them? No. They form a super crime-fighting duo. So, CSS Grid is really awesome and it's great for layouts. And Flexbox is also really awesome and it's great for flowing content and centering things vertically, which is a massive overuse of a fairly technical spec. So therefore, Grid and Flexbox form a super CSS layout duo. These two specs both complement each other. Yes, you could replace everything with Flexbox with Grid, but a lot of the time it's overkill. If I'm doing something like a nav bar, I'm going to go Flexbox every time. If I'm trying to center something vertically, it's going to be Flexbox. But if I'm building out the layout of an app, then yes, I'm going to use CSS Grid. It's worth using both of them and knowing which one you should use when. Now, if I take away all of my beautiful background colors and effects, this is looking pretty good. I mean, I wouldn't say ship it, but we've got a pretty good app there. And considering how much code we've written, that's pretty impressive. But this is okay while I've only got a couple of notes. I really want an overall view where I can see them all at once. So we're going to build a different view where we've got cards. So to do this, again, we're going to define columns. So we're going to say grid template columns, 100, 300 pixels. Now, this is okay, but this means our grid needs to be 3,000 pixels wide. It's not very responsive, is it? So instead, I'm going to say repeat autofill, 300 pixels. Now, autofill is something else that comes with the repeat function. There's two of them, autofill and autofit. And there's a really great visual representation in this CodePen by Sarah Soden, which shows them. Now, autofill fills the row with as many columns as it can fit, even if you don't have enough elements to fill them. Whereas autofit will put in as many columns as it needs for the elements, and then stretches them out to take up the extra space. Or you can just do what I do and just flick between the two of them until it does the one that you want to do. So this is like the one thing I still have to read off my slides because I could not tell you which one does which. So if I say repeat autofill, anyone remember which one that does? As many columns as you can fit, even if we're not going to need them. So repeat autofill 100 pixels, as many 100 pixel columns as you can fit in. So if we have a look at our columns, we say autofill 300 pixels, as many 300 pixel columns as you can fit, even if we're not going to need them. But then what happens if we've got, say, 250 pixels left over? That's not enough for a column, and our grid's not going to line up with everything else, which may be okay, but the designer says everything's got to line up perfectly. So instead, we're going to say repeat autofill min-max 300 pixels, 1FR. Now min-max does what you'd expect it to. It defines a minimum and a maximum. Again, you can use any units you like, pixels, ems, rems, percentage, viewport widths, viewport heights, the FR unit we learned earlier, you can use them all. So minimum of 100 pixels, maximum of 20 viewport widths. Minimum of 100 pixels, maximum of 1FR. Minimum of 1FR, maximum of 300 pixels. These all work. So I can go repeat autofill, as many columns as we can fit, even if we don't need them. Min-max 300 pixels. So they should be 300 pixels wide at least, but then expand out to take extra space. That means if we have 250 pixels left over, it's going to expand to make sure the grid aligns where it should. So you can see here, our cards have now taken their places in columns. But it's a bit weird. I want nice little compact cards. That looks really weird. So we're going to define rows as well. And we can say grid template rows, repeat autofill, as many as we can fit, even if we don't need them. And they're just going to be 150 pixels high. So it's not bad. Nice little cards. But they're fairly cramped. So we want to add a gap between them. And so this is where we're going to use the gap property that we touched on earlier. And so I want to define grid column gap 20 pixels. So this says that between each of the columns, I want a 20 pixel gap. I then want to have a gap between each of the rows. So I'm going to say grid row gap 20 pixels. Or I can use the shorthand and just say grid gap 20 pixels because I want it to be the same gap between each row and each column. Now, one question people often ask is, well, why can't I just use margins? I can just use margins for that. Because margins have issues for this. So you've probably encountered things like this where you things, putting a margin means it doesn't line up properly, so you've got to add a negative margin so then the children are out where they should be. Or you get to do these lovely nth child recipes where, well, every fifth one shouldn't have one on the right, and every fifth one plus one shouldn't have one on the left, and the first five shouldn't have one on the top, and the last five shouldn't have one on the bottom, which then changes when your grid changes size. Or grid gap 20 pixels. So if we add that, we're now starting to get nice little gaps between each of our cards. Now, this is where we can also have a look at Firefox's grid inspector again, and we can see these are all the spaces we've got in our grid, even though we don't actually need them. And you can also see the gap between each of them. So again, if you're doing grid, use Firefox's grid inspector. I swear they're not paying me. I just believe in it that much. Now again, if we take away all of my beautiful colors, it's not bad, right? It's pretty good. Now, is it just me, or does this sound too good to be true? Like, this would clearly make our lives easier. What's the catch? What am I not mentioning? Yeah. So it's better than you might think. So as I said, this has been around since 2017, and for the first time, it kind of all happened at once because CSS Grid was actually developed under a feature flag, which meant that when we were all getting it, all the kinks were pretty much ironed out. So Chrome has had it since 57, Firefox since 52, Safari since 10.1, Edge since 16, and well, that's all the browsers, right? So has Grid since 10? Sort of. So IE was actually the first browser to implement CSS Grid. I know, right, mind-blowing. But they did it way, way back when it was a completely different version of the spec, and because it's no longer maintained, it hasn't actually been updated. So IE does a completely different thing with Grid. Depending on what you're doing, it may still work for you. You can find their version of the spec if you're bored or really procrastinating or have difficulty sleeping, and find out to see if that would work for you. Otherwise, it may be best to just leave it alone. Now, what do these numbers actually mean? Well, globally, we're looking at 91% support for CSS Grid. That's pretty good, right? So you know how we used SubGrid before, the really cool thing that changed everything and was just really great? So, what I didn't mention, so SubGrid launched about 2 months ago in Firefox Nightly, not even Firefox Dev version, Firefox Nightly only. So you definitely cannot use this in production, but it is available to start playing around with. So I got to use it myself for the first time when I was updating this talk a few months ago. It was really exciting to get to use something so new. So download Firefox Nightly and have a look if you're interested. Remember, Flexbox has been around for a while longer, so their support's looking fairly good, 98%, and in my opinion, those 2% remaining, they can deal with it. Those 2% are used to websites not looking nice. One of the other great things we have with this is the supports query. So the supports query, if you haven't used it before, is a CSS query that allows us to define a CSS property and a value, and then put code inside of it. And if the browser doesn't know what to do with the property and value, it won't use the code. Now, supports is fairly new, like it's been around for a while, but it is still fairly new. The great thing is, if a browser doesn't know what to do with supports, there is no way it's going to know what to do with grid, and it's just going to ignore the whole lot anyway. So, for example, I can say supports display grid. I can put my grid code inside of this, and if a browser doesn't know what to do with that, it's not going to use the grid code. This is really useful because it means we're not delivering code to browsers where they're not supporting the properties that we're using. There is one issue with this though, because remember this guy? So if you give it supports display grid, you goes, I got this, I know this one, I know this one, I can do it, I got it. Except it's using a completely different spec. So depending on what properties you're using, it's got no clue what any of the code inside of your supports query is doing, or it does something completely different to what you're expecting. The great thing is though, you can instead do a supports query for a property that it doesn't support. For example, grid template areas. You don't actually need to define areas, you can just say dot to say there is an area. And I will look at this and go, no, got no clue. And it will leave it all alone. So what you can do is just support grid template areas, and then put all of your grid code inside of it. That means that any of those browsers that don't know what to do with it, they're just not going to touch it. This is pretty awesome, right? This is exciting. You can use this. You can go back. I know you can all go back to your team. You can go, yes, I learned about this thing. It was a really amazing talk that I totally rated 5 stars for. It gave really great feedback. And we should start using this now. And I know exactly what your team is going to say. But so today, I'm going to give you answers for that but. But there's not enough support. 91%. That's pretty good support. It completely depends on your use case. Anyone from Bankwest, I'm really sorry. I know you can't use this. I used to work at Bankwest. It's fine. I know the deal. You've also got the supports query. So remember, if someone doesn't support it, they're not going to get your grid code. But then we have to write a fallback. Does your layout currently work in those browsers? You've already got one. Your current code is your fallback. You can just write a grid alternative inside of a supports query that will only go to the browsers that can do it. But we don't have time to do all of that. The secret is you don't actually have to use this everywhere. Pick one thing. The blog page, one particular layout in a part of your application or website. Implement grid there, then go from there. But then we'll have to maintain it. Who here uses Bootstrap at work? Guess what? CSS Grid is CSS. There aren't frameworks to update and maintain and check to see whether or not something's broken. This will literally take less time to maintain than whatever you're using now. It's just CSS. So, to sum up my talk, I'm going to cover the really amazing points, the really important points. CSS Grid is awesome. That was it, right? That was it? Yeah. No, in all seriousness, CSS Grid is amazing. It is fantastic to use. It makes your life easier. There are still times when I realize I can use Grid for something or a particular use case. I go, oh yeah, I can do that. I can do this with Grid. And there's a mic drop moment and a happy dance, and my dog looks at me weird because I work at home by myself, and so there's no one there to see the happy dance. And then I message my boss or my friends and go, I can do this thing with Grid. And they have no clue what I'm talking about. Well, she will now because she's sitting right at the back, but she hasn't been listening, so she still has no clue what I'm doing. There are a lot of really great resources out there. Again, I'm tweeting these out as we speak, so don't worry if I'm going through them too fast. CSS Tricks has a really amazing guide to grid. I use this every day. I'm pretty sure I really messed up their stats when I wrote this talk because I was constantly reloading the page because I'd close it and come straight back to it. If you're wanting to get started, Wes Boss has a really amazing CSS Grid course. Guess what? It's free. If you're familiar with any of his JavaScript talks, JavaScript courses, you can have a look at that one. Even if you're the kind of person who doesn't like doing video courses, I recommend looking anyway. I hate doing video courses, but these ones are great. If you're a little bit more old-fashioned, no, I'm not making fun of you. I have this book. This is a really great book from Rachel Andrew. Goes through a lot about CSS layout, particularly CSS Grid. Really anything by Rachel Andrew is good for grid. She's got a lot of blog posts and talks as well as written books. I would actually recommend anything by Rachel Andrew or Jen Simmons. I would like to credit them with creating grid, but I have absolutely no idea if that's true. They just do a lot of talking about it. If you're looking for a really fun way to do it, you can use CSS Grid Garden, which is a nice, fun way to learn all of the different grid properties. And if you haven't learned Flexbox yet, or you want a refresher, they also have Flexbox Froggy. Thank you, everybody, for having me along.